Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Brandon Stiver, who I'm here with live in my basement. This is the first ever live Theology in the Raw recording in my basement with an actual physical guest in the new basement. New basement.
You can touch me.
I know. He's real. Sometimes I wonder if my guests are just AI or something. But You're real. You're live in the flesh. So welcome to the Theology in the Raw basement.
Thanks, man. It's good to be with you.
So Brandon was on the show. Was it about 2 years ago ish?
Yeah, about 2 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
I kept calling you the wrong.
Good to be back. Yeah, no,
I kept calling you the wrong name.
It's just a turnaround for me, dude. Yeah, the first time around, you kept calling me Brian for like half. I had to. No. And now here it's like, well, I slept on the other side of this wall, so I had a good bit of a come up. No, when that show came up. I had friends from church. I'd be like, "Oh, dude, you were on Theology in the Raw," and my pastor's name is Brian. So I told him, I was like, "Dude, it was kind of like you were on the show because half the show he called me Brian, so it was kind of both of us together." So we had a good laugh.
I don't know why I kept calling you Brian. That's not the first time. I have messed up names, especially pronunciation. I'm just
that's fine. Well, we've gotten to break bread a few times since then, and you haven't done it again. So.
Okay, good. So, I literally almost said,
"Bro, don't do it."
Brandon has become, I would say, kind of my go-to resource when it comes to thinking through anything related to missions, cross-cultural ministry, or orphan care, which we're going to get into, short-term missions, just that whole space that, I don't know, and we can just get right into it and say there's been a lot of church engagement. Some of which has been awesome, some of which has been okay, some of which has been well-intended, but producing not really good things. Outcomes. Yeah, that's a soft way of putting it. So there's a famous book called When Helping Hurts, when people try to help people and actually you're well-intended, but you're actually hurting them.
Right.
And that was, I don't know, a turning point, but that's one that kind of like brought awareness maybe to a lot of people that kind of were feeling something, and then that book was really influential in my life, at least.
Totally.
And then, gosh, that was like 15 plus years
right.
ago, I think. So anyway, thank you for being a resource.
Yeah. And orphan care is really one of those places. And, Brian's been on your show. He's been on our show. He's a great guy. And that was really kind of like a clarion call, I think, a lot. And especially with, When Helping Hurts coming out, probably came out. I mean, I remember getting into it in like 2010. So it was probably like 2008, 2009, 2010. Somewhere in there when Brian and Steve Corbett released that book, and it was like a clarion call because especially you were in SoCal, so was I. Yeah. We're part of that kind of big missional movement, and even for those like in the orphan care space, it was just kind of like, well, what are we going to do? Well, let's go build orphanages, let's go help orphans, and that was kind of like always the thing, and that's the value of hearing from people like Brian Fickert and Steve Corbett, where they're like, well, let's actually think what these engagements look like. And the funny thing is, I remember reading When Helping Hurts. I mean, you bring up that book in particular, which was so seminal in a lot of ways. And I was working at an orphanage thinking like, oh yeah, this is really good. This is really good. Not even like having it dawn on me necessarily that it's like, oh, actually some of the practices that we're promoting in this form of orphan care is actually hurting. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's actually kind of interesting where it's like on one hand, you can read a book like that. And a lot of what Brian was pulling from was from other development professionals like Jayakumar Christian, Bryant Myers, and his book, when Walking with the Poor. So he's pulling from a lot of those scholars, but then making it like something that everybody can get into. And, that book was really successful. But it is one of those interesting things where it's like people are reading that and not even realizing, oh, actually, as I'm reading this, I'm actually still kind of a part of that industry of kind of causing harm more than actually helping. And it's just kind of interesting because I first read that book even when I was still working at the orphanage and didn't go through my own process of actually rethinking what that practice looks like. It's kind of a weird thing.
Tell us a bit about your background. So, and people can go back and maybe in the show notes, I'll try to put the actual show number, so people can just kind of go find it. It's about 2 years ago when you came on. You gave a long overview
of kind
of your transition from orphanage-based orphan care to family-based orphan care.
Right,
Is
right.
that right phrasing? Or
Yeah, that works. Yeah,
close
yeah,
enough?
yeah.
Okay, I'll let you fill in. Tweak it. Let's go back to
Sure. Yeah,
you're
yeah.
working at an orphanage, and what are some things that led to your rethinking of that model?
It's actually funny if you kind of. So I first initially, entered this space with what really felt like a call from God, and I was at Rock Harbor Church in 2007 in Costa Mesa, California, and it was like feeling like God tell me go run an orphanage in Africa. So it was very much so a lot of kind of my journey, even from a practice standpoint, has always really been intertwined with my sense of spiritual calling. This is what God told me to go do. And a lot of what I've had to do is kind of unpack those things simultaneously, and even come to realization that, this is a journey, this is discipleship, this is a long-term process. Sometimes we kind of view calling as kind of like this like point in time, and I'm going to arrive there and then I've fulfilled my calling. But I really think there's a component of spiritual formation and discipleship there where it's actually God's just calling us to get on the road, and then we'll learn as we go along. So I really kind of feel like, yeah, it started in 2007, feeling the sense of calling, at my mega church in Southern California. I had 1 year left of undergrad at that time. This is 2007, quite a while ago now. And, actually started to get my feet moving. And I think that was kind of the impetus was that sense of calling. And God used words that I was able to understand. If God were to say, you know, Brandon, I want you to, go establish a family-based care ministry in northern Tanzania or whatever, I would have been like, I can't even find Tanzania on a map, and what's family-based care? But it was like, go run an orphanage. And it was like, oh, okay, I'm supposed to be caring for orphans. I need to start this journey. So a lot of kind of my maturation, discipleship, and so forth was really kind of based out of that, initial calling, but then also recognizing God's calling me forward. So ended up, I did the short term thing. I did the child sponsorship thing. I ended up working at an orphanage. I basically did all the stuff that now I would tell people, actually, let's rethink that, including the child sponsorship, including the short term missions, which, we've talked about before. And I was meeting with some of your guys' interns that you guys are going out to Africa. And, so those are really pertinent conversations, especially for people that are Americans and have a heart for the nations, which we absolutely want to affirm and encourage, because we should be thinking globally. We should be thinking in terms of what's going on in other nations and what's going on in other countries, and how can we help the vulnerable? The people that are impoverished in a place like sub-Saharan Africa is a whole other level, and it's so much more intractable in many ways than you might even find here, in Boise or Washington, where I live, or whatever. So it is important that we are thinking about, and pursuing justice for those, people in other countries. So I think God just got my feet moving. And but working at the orphanage, you start to kind of see some things, especially with the kid's family. Like, I think that was a big thing. Like, when we think of orphans, we think of Oliver Twist or, Harry Potter. It's like, they have no parents, and that's our definition. But the reality is most kids that are in orphanages do still have, 4 out of 5 of them still have one, if not both of their parents still alive, much less the fact that they have other family,
4 out of 5. So
4 out of 5.
80%.
80%
in orphanages have at least one surviving parent.
Yeah, that's the global number. And it'll vary. Sometimes it can go up to like 90%. That would be like the number in Haiti. Sometimes it's less, You can get a little bit more what we call gatekeeping, which is just basically making sure it's like an assessment and like evaluating, should a kid enter alternative care? Should they not? You can get more of that in other countries, which will kind of help kids stay at home. But yeah, overall, the number is generally around 80%. Wow. So 4 out of 5 kids. And that's certainly the case in places like East Africa, where I was doing missions work. So yeah, you start to kind of learn, okay, these kids have family. And even if the kid, is a true double orphan, meaning they've lost both of their parents, they still have other family, that they have a connection to. And what I started to kind of consider was the fact that we would actually see some of these, family members that would come and they would visit with the kids. And I never stopped and thought like, okay, this, is an American run orphanage. if you check the 990 form, it's like $500,000 a year, 26 kids. Why aren't we investing some of these funds out into the community to actually help these kids, grow up with their family? But that just was never even a thought.
So $500,000 a year for 26 kids. I would
Right.
imagine a place like Tanzania or most countries in
Right.
East Africa that you can care for more than 26
families. Dude, I mean, yeah,
so if it was a poverty issue, why they couldn't take care of their kid, that could be easily solved with the money that's going in.
Right. And it's just a matter of where do we want to invest. So if our cost per beneficiary, if we were to kind of talk about this from like global development type of language, if we were to say that that's like $16,000-$17,000 a kid, and it's just like, yeah, raising kids in Tacoma, Washington was pretty expensive. I don't spend $17,000 per kid, So it's a pretty inefficient model. And then at the end of the day, you have, unfortunately, tragically, you have kids that are separated from their family, separated from their community.
Yeah.
And we, as people that are outsiders, that are hopefully finding a way to, in a healthy and in a productive and in a safe way, come alongside them. We could be doing that in another way by providing other types of services. Mm-hmm. So we really came out of that orphanage time. And I think actually the biggest light bulb was after we left the children's home later that same year, my daughter was born, my daughter Promise. And for me, because my calling was very wrapped up in my emotion, that was, the emotion of that experience was almost kind of subverted when I felt the actual emotion of what it felt like to be a father. Because I had always kind of had that as my identity. Like, I'm a father to these orphans, and God's a father to the fatherless. So I'm doing the same thing as him, or, and just kind of like taking that mantle and that identity when in reality, I wasn't a father to them. Huh. They needed fathers, and they needed mothers, but there was no way that I could actually fill that role for them. And nonetheless, that's what they needed. But once I actually became a father, it was like the emotional thing that actually made my reasoning so, again, relatively intractable. It actually started to turn when that emotion, switched. So,
what are some other? So let's just summarize. So one of the main, well, I'll just call it, problems with orphanage-based orphan care is that 80% of these kids have one surviving parent. Is it usually due to money that they drop them off at the orphanage, or could there be an unsafe home environment? I guess then the kid wouldn't be dropping. I mean,
right. So
yeah, what are some of the reasons why this possible both parents are dropping their kids off at orphanages?
So poverty is a big factor, but poverty is not the only factor. So if you were to go into a place like Moshi, Tanzania, where I was, where you guys are going to be traveling to Entebbe, Uganda, on this trip with some friends and colleagues of mine as well, you can go around and you're going to find lots of families that are dealing with poverty.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And do all those kids live in orphanages? No, most of them live home, right? And even if you look at 140 million orphans throughout the world, well, only like 5.4 kids live in orphanages. So even if we were thinking like orphans need orphanages, which is not actually the case, orphans need families. The reality is we can never build enough orphanages to solve that orphan crisis, right? So, so poverty is a reason and loss of a primary caregiver is a reason, but it's normally a combination of multiple. So what we tend to say is it's poverty plus. So it's poverty plus something else. Poverty plus disability. Poverty plus a family event, loss of a primary caregiver. Poverty plus, desire to access education. Poverty plus, and it's always something else. So it's never poverty just by itself, but sometimes it's poverty that then leads to another issue, or poverty just plus another issue that kind of develops.
Okay. So there's multiple factors, but poverty seems to be kind of a main one.
It's an undergirding one, and that's why we need community development, and that's why we need, even from an international and global development standpoint, we have these multinational corporations that create these kind of long chains of if I were to look at my shirt, it might say made in such and such country, and then it's sold in this country, and then it's dumped in East Africa. multinational corporations are creating these chains. And for us as American Christians, saying to say, well, what's my role in global missions or
Mhm.
global nonprofit work or whatever, is we have to create healthy chains. But what we don't want to do is do the things that, like Brian talks about in his book,
Mhm.
you know, that create dependency and so forth.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, the orphanage system creates a lot of dependency, and the adult outcomes for those kids are just really bad.
Yeah. What are some things in the environment of the orphanage that most people maybe that haven't worked in an orphanage don't realize? Like we've talked it. I mean, it was kind of blowing my mind. Like some of the stuff you're telling me, like, you
Yeah.
know, like you put a bunch of kids with probably a lot of trauma. Detachment
100%.
disorder is pretty much every
Yeah,
kid by
attachment disorders,
definition,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And like, yeah. So what? Tell us about maybe. So we just think there's always, you know, and if you visit an orphanage, kids come up, ear to ear smile, you're handing out
Right.
candy, you're giving hugs,
Right.
selfies, IG photos, you know. So it just seems like, gosh, we're doing so much. These kids are happy. They've got a good life. They probably had a horrible life before they got into orphanage.
Yeah.
Like the perception is really, I can see why people would say,
Right.
this is amazing. We need more of these orphanages,
Right.
you know? So
Yeah.
tell us, you worked in orphanage for many
Right.
years. Like tell us maybe some of the things people don't realize.
Well, there is that kind of gratifying emotional, you know, thing that kind of is stirred up, you know, when you're the American and, you know, the gates of of the orphanage open up and you're in Latin America or Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, wherever you are, and you walk in and the kids are like, yeah, wazungu, you know, like, and you know, that's actually very gratifying. It would be like addictive, like kind of like, I don't know, was that dopamine
you
or
feel
adrenaline,
needed,
something?
you feel,
Yeah.
it's like 1,000 likes on Instagram. I mean,
Oh yeah. And then you add that whole aspect. So I mean, if that is our primary viewpoint, then of course, yeah, we're gonna walk away thinking like, that's awesome. I'm gonna give money there. I'm gonna support that system. I want the best for those kids, which is true, you know, and that was certainly the case for me and different teams that I was a part of. Like you want the best for those kids. But unfortunately, the wires just don't always connect because it's like, well, what's the best for those kids? The best for those kids is hopefully to be within a family that's as local as possible.
Mhm.
You know, so even something like international adoption should really kind of be like almost like a last resort as well. You know what I mean? Like we should want all of these kids to be in local families. But going back to what you had asked, you know, the whole kind of cross-cultural dynamic, I mean, I remember, um so I went to the children's home that I ended up working at the first time in 2008. We were part of a team from the Christian university that I had been attending. I went back the following summer and I saw the same kids and I held up a picture of my team and I said, "Do you remember them?" And as I was holding it up, this is before I learned Swahili, but as I held it up, they kept pointing at me in the picture. I was like, yeah. Okay, I know. Yes, that's me. But what about him? What about her? I'm pointing at other people in my team and they're like, I don't know who that is, you know? And it's just kind of like they forget because it's such a revolving door, you know? So even that emotion of saying like, oh, look at these kids. They're running up to me. They love me. They need me. They want me. Let's hug. Let's cuddle. Let's, you know, whatever. Let's dance. Let's tickle, you know, they're getting that with a lot of other people. And then they'll forget you, you know, and I don't say that to be like, you know, because I understand like those are often the best memories for many people that, you know, did volunteering overseas. But the reality is that's your reality. The reality for these kids is that's just a revolving door. And when that team leaves, the kids get bummed out, you know, because that was an adrenaline high for them too, you know, because like you said, you guys are bringing candy, you guys are playing soccer with them, you guys are doing all this. So, you know, that is, there is that kind of letdown. Now, you mentioned attachment disorders. You know, attachment disorders start when the kid has the relationship severed, foremost with the mom, but potentially with other people where they've developed attachment. And there's different people that have different views of attachment, but attachment is a fairly exclusive thing in my estimation and according to people that I've worked and partnered with. So I have attachment with my kids. I have attachment with my wife. You have attachment with your mom, your dad, your wife, you know, and it's just like these are very intimate relationships. When a kid has had those kind of primary attachments, especially with their mom severed, an attachment disorder can develop, right? And sometimes that means they're attaching in a way that is reactive. Sometimes that means that they have a disorganized attachment. Sometimes that means, so there's these different, and I mean, I'm not a neuropsychologist, but there are these kind of different ways that people attach, and not all of them are healthy.
Mm.
So then what happens is that attachment has been ruptured, and then now that kid has, not just like the short term missionaries that come through, but even staff. It's like you're paying staff to go and work with them, and then but that for those staff, that's a job. So even they might bail, at different points. It's just like last time I was on your podcast, I was working for one organization. Now I work for a different nonprofit.
Yeah.
Like people leave their jobs, people go and they find different work. That's fine. That's normal. That's a normal thing for a workplace. But for a child, who that's their residence, that's their home, that's where they live, to have that, it exacerbates the severed attachment that they already had.
Mm.
So attachment disorders are very common. Trauma and abuse is very common. That was something we talked quite a bit about last time I was on the show. So all of these things kind of add up, and it's a lot of adversity in a kid's childhood, which is fundamentally detrimental to their development and ultimately who they become when they're older.
Real quick on the detachment disorder thing, like when a team of Americans shows up in an orphanage, loves on these kids, plays with them, hugs them, tickles them,
right,
holds them, like you're getting the selfies and everything for 5 days, and then they leave. What's that doing to somebody with attachment disorder? Like, because we don't see, we wave by and they're crying.
Right.
I'll send you a picture.
Right. I'll be back next summer. Yeah.
What's that doing to that disorder?
So it's exacerbating it for them, but so it's making it
pretty
worse.
Categorical, like that's not like it could be. But it's like
no. It's making it worse. Yeah, for sure. But some people will say that's causing the attachment disorder. That's not the root cause. The root cause is that their primary attachment was severed, but then it gets worse and worse the more you just kind of revolve people in and say bond, pull away, bond, pull away.
Short-term intimate relationships are not healthy at all.
Not healthy for them. And the other stuff that you were talking about, that's getting into another area where, it's not normal and it's not healthy for a kid to be uncommonly familiar with a stranger. Okay. So we had this example today when we were talking with your short-term team. We're visiting you and Chris. You guys have been awesome hosts. We brought our 3 youngest. Our oldest is playing basketball with his friends. We brought our 3 youngest, and you brought in some young ladies that are going on this trip. They see my kids there. My kids are 4, 9, 11, right? So these are like the ages of kids that you maybe were interacting with on your short-term mission trip, right? When these young ladies walk in, they don't be like, oh, there's kids here. I'm going to pick these kids up and hug them. And it's just like, and of course that would be so like inappropriate, right? What are you doing? Like, who are you? Why are you touching my kid? But that's because they go into that and they say, oh, these are, I don't know these kids. It appears that this is their dad. That's their mom. Like, I'm just going to say, hi, what's your name? And, what school do you go to? Or like those kind of like questions, like get to know you, like you would get to know another person. But unfortunately, when we go into those orphanages, we don't stop and think like these are somebody else's kids.
We kind of feel entitled to immediate intimacy with these kids.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, that has been the conditioning. But what happens now when that kid has been conditioned to have intimate touch, intimate connection with strangers? So when you say like the kid is now, an adult, and they not only have that severed attachment, they not only have trauma, which can be physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, other types of dysfunction. Like if you go through the adverse childhood experiences study, those types of situations that take place in the kid's, childhood. And now they're out in the world, and what are they they're going to go look for stranger love. And what can that look like? It looks like, again, perpetuating the system of dysfunction at the family level, looking at exploitation. So they're more likely to get into exploitative, and trafficking situations because they've essentially been conditioned, aside from all the trauma and the fact that they're not connected with their family and community of origin. Now they're also more susceptible to, falling into other forms of exploitation. So
do you see that happen? Like, Orphanage, they fall into.
For sure. Yeah. It's and sadly, so, last time I was working with a different organization. Now I'm working with an organization called CarePortal, which is really focused on domestic, creating better ecosystems domestically with care sharing technology. Because what we see in foster care is unfortunately, a lot of the same stuff, higher rates. So like over 50% of people that are homeless had foster care involvement in their childhood. They're more likely to be trafficked. They're more likely to live in poverty. They're like 75 to 80% of the incarcerated people in our country were involved in the child welfare and foster care system in our country.
Wow.
So unfortunately, anytime that kid has been removed and gone through that adversity and they haven't been able to land permanency, unfortunately, the adult outcomes, whether it's here in the US or whether it's back in Tanzania where I was, those are just going to be really poor. So that's why it's really important that we actually have, healthy environments for those kids and that there's support there.
Talk to me about, I know like abuse in orphanages is unfortunately, it happens, and it happens at a higher rate than people realize, right?
Sure.
That's something I never even thought about. So I talked to, Alicia first, our mutual friend, and then you and other people I've talked to that like, oh yeah, this is a huge problem in orphanages. Is that among the kids? Is it staff? Is it good people, bad people, all the above? I mean,
all of the above,
do you have
for
any
sure.
stats or anything on something like that?
So I don't have any stats right off the top, but unfortunately, what we know in general when it comes to abuse, including sexual abuse, is that it is always underreported. So even if I had the stats, they would only kind of scratch the surface in many ways, because even here, anytime there's abuse, anytime there's sexual assault, anything, like, it gets underreported. So that's just kind of baseline. In terms of abuse within orphanages, look, you have removed the kids from the most natural baseline of protection, which is having parents. So if you and I are both believers in Christian nonviolence, so I acknowledge that. But if somebody was messing with my daughter or messing with my son,
we might set that aside.
We might set that aside, because it's like, well, what am I going to do? I'm the dad. I'm going to protect, and that. But now you've removed that kind of just baseline human protection. And unfortunately, a lot of these places don't have policies and practices in place. So when you're not prioritizing child protection, kids will get violated. And that's just what happens. And it can be anybody. It can be staff to child. So you can definitely see that a lot with like physical abuse, like using very harsh forms of corporal punishment and so forth. You definitely see it. Peer to peer is the most common. So older kids taking advantage of younger kids. And look,
the sexual abuse.
For sure.
Would you say in most orphanages there's some of that going on? Or is it just hard to
so I will just kind of say, so at one point we were working with a larger organization, brought out a colleague from Bethany Christian Services Global, and they were working with us when we were running Kingdom Families in Tanzania. And I remember talking with, so we had my friend Sabilu there, and then there was a social worker. Her name was Jill Vanderbent. And I remember her saying something that just kind of resonated. So she had been working with a lot of kids that had been in orphanages, and she has said, I have not provided counsel to a single kid that was in an orphanage that didn't either view and like see another kid get abused, be victimized by another kid, or be the perpetrator. Like literally, and she's counseled so many different kids that have come out of orphanages, and she's like, they've all seen it, or they've all, either suffered from it or participated in it. And it happens in the quote unquote good orphanages as well. And that's a whole thing. There's really, what we say is there's better orphanages and worse orphanages, but there's no good orphanages. You know what I mean? So it's like some orphanages are going to be worse in terms of child protection. I did study, there's stuff like, there's a report from Disability Rights International where they were basically, this is in Eastern Europe, where they were running the orphanage under a basement as a brothel. So sometimes these are just straight up exploitation, trafficking type of fronts. I did some of my research at Multnomah, where I teach now. I had done some of my research on what we call SECTT, that's sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. And you can see a lot of this in places like Southeast Asia. You think Thailand, Cambodia, like those types of places, you'll see a lot of sexual exploitation of children in travel and tourism. I actually focus most of my graduate research on sub-Saharan Africa. And in my human slavery class, I focus specifically on East Africa. And what we saw were cases where people would come, I followed 4 case studies, 2 from the UK, 2 from the US, where these people would come and they would volunteer or they would set up a nonprofit or whatever, and they would pray on children through that, And sometimes this is like, I mean, I could list names. I don't know if that's going to serve anybody, but you could find it, where people are even there on a Christian mission, I think of Gregory Dow, I think was one of his names. He set up this orphanage in Kenya and he was, abusing the kids. Matthew Lane Durham doing the same thing. So it's like, these are things, and I'm not like I only say that because like you can actually go, because these were people that were Christian missionaries that were setting up these things where the child protection just isn't there. You have a guy who, is working for an airline. He's traveling into Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and they're exploiting children. They're abusing children. And unfortunately, those things where we run up, we walk in as the good people, like we're not going to harm any children. And we say, well, we just want to play and yeah, we'll hug and we'll do all this. What is that doing? Again, that is conditioning the kids. That's conditioning the staff. Oh, white people, they're safe. It's okay. But then when that dude walks in and he says, oh, I'm staying at this hotel. Can I bring the kids over to go do a swim? And the orphanage worker is like, yeah, that's fine, because he just donated a ton of money or brought all the kids soccer balls or whatever. And then he takes them to the hotel and he abuses them. So this is just a reality that we can't, and it would be, easy for you or me to like go on a short-term trip. And yeah, we interacted with some orphans or kids that were in an orphanage and we didn't do anything. So it's not our fault. Okay, that's true. Like we went into that space, we did not abuse children, but we fed into an environment where there's this kind of trust and this kind of expectation that other people that are predators are going into and then making the most of that. And look, this is even within that research that I did. I had there were 2 people, one from the US and one from the UK, that actually had been had records within their countries of origin of preying on minors. And that didn't stop them from being able to fly into East Africa to then prey on those children. Okay. So, and I only really kind of bring this up because you and I are Americans and we're thinking, what can we do or what should we do when it comes to, and we had it on our podcast where we actually got into this with professionals that are working in this space, the child protection, what are the mechanisms that are in place? What does the short-term piece look like? Because, we have to think through what should we be doing different. But the reality is we're feeding into a system that is fundamentally failing kids.
How widely known is everything you're saying among people who are working in orphan care, let's just say overseas, maybe in majority world countries? Is this pretty widely known, or is your voice in the minority? Because I would say in sending churches or churches in America, I mean, people don't think twice about supporting orphanages.
Right.
I mean, this is the 3rd podcast I've done on this. My church supports an orphan.
Right. Yeah.
And they celebrate all the, and like
right.
It's so in America at least, it seems like I rarely talk to anybody that hasn't even thought about anything other than orphanages. But in the field, like people actually work in this field, are there a lot of people like you that kind of started to see things? And
yeah, it's going to be a mix. And really, there's kind of been 2 Brandons. There was the Brandon that was working at the orphanage where I thought I was, whatever. I thought it was Mother Teresa or something, George Mueller, and thinking like, I'm going to tell everybody and they're actually supporting me so that then I'll go and support these kids. So it's like, I'm actually feeding into the industry and the economy and all of that. So there's people that are still like that Brandon from like 2007 to 2012 or whatever. Like that person is still there and they're still raising funds and telling the stories and sending the pictures and doing all of that. And there's a lot more of those than there are the people that, when my family returned, to the missions field and ran Kingdom Families for 5 years, and we were just like, look, the church has to be mobilized. We're going to work with the church. We're going to do advocacy. We're going to do some social services here. We're going to do things that are going to strengthen families. Those people are out there too. And there is a growing movement. I want to acknowledge that because I've worked with some of the best people that many of them used to, they used to run orphanages. And they came to the realization, like, actually, we could be doing this better. And that's a whole thing. Like, what we don't want to do is be like, shame on you, tisk, totally. Like you shouldn't do that, because it's like, well, my hands are as guilty as anyone. But the reality is, it is discipleship. Yes, maybe you had a calling to get started in this field, but what does it look like to learn and to grow and to be discipled and learn new things and then apply them, to our practice when it comes to caring for vulnerable people? So I think that that's kind of a really core thing.
There's a growing number of.
There's a growing number, and it's a movement. It's not just about one organization. I mean, I know last time I was on the show, I was working with a different organization, and organizations can just change like that. And then they say, we're just going to do something else. But it's not about one single organization. It's about a movement of organizations that say, we're going to prioritize family. We can actually, these kids that are in our care, 4 out of 5 of them still have one, if not both of their parents still alive. I mean, what are we going to say? 95% of them, we can find some relative, Could we move move our intervention into their home rather than into our children's home? Can we get the kid out of a children's home and put them into a parent's home? Can we do that? And as people kind of turn those lights on, and that's even what we do. So after I left my previous org, we set up a team that can actually help people walk through those, just at Canopy International, which is my side grind, but just creating opportunities for people to learn and to say, well, what would this look like? So those resources are out there. I'm on the advisory network for an organization called Faith to Action, which is doing great work. I have been facilitating a community of practice that stretches from Southeast Asia all the way to Central America. All of these, organizations like Alicia, who you had on, or like Brent Phillips in Cherish Uganda, who you guys are going to visit. Yeah. Organizations like that say we're prioritizing family care. You look at someone like Brent, it's just like, man, they were serving HIV/AIDS kids, in Uganda, and even them, they're like, oh yeah, no, we could transition. And then what do you see? You look at an organization like Cherish, and they transition. They send kids, they help kids safely reunify back with family or enter alternative families if that's what needed, foster care, adoption. Sometimes that's what's needed. And then do they just close up shop? Hopefully not. Hopefully what they do is they say, well, we're really good at caring for HIV/AIDS communities, so we're going to open up this clinic. Or what they're doing now is they have this birthing center, right? So now they're going to help kids when maybe mom's HIV positive, but if you handle the birth the right way, she won't transmit to her child. So now we're creating these types of things that are actually going to strengthen families and take care of communities so that the communities are stronger. So I've seen that, and that's the good thing. And it is a movement. It's not one organization. Yeah. It's a lot of organizations that are coming to this realization, saying, how can we help move this forward?
Hey friends, I wanted to let you know about an awesome ministry doing incredible work in Africa. It's called Cherish Uganda. Cherish Uganda's mission is to spiritually transform its community through education, healthcare, and family strengthening programs. Cherish believes that children thrive in the context of families and not institutions. Okay, so Cherish started as an orphanage for HIV-positive children several years ago, but then they learned that children often had extended family that could care for them with the right intervention and training. No matter how hard they tried to give the best care for a child, they learned that an organization can never replace the value God created when He created families. Now, rather than short-term based home care, Cherish continues to focus its care for children and families with HIV through education programs, a health center, and family strengthening programming. All children are now resettled. All children. So all the children that were in the orphanage, they're now settled with a family member, or have been reintegrated into the community with extended relatives or foster families. Cherish now empowers the community to care for its own, fostering self-reliance and sustainability. And just several months ago, on World AIDS Day, December 1st, 2023, Cherish opened its birthing center. Now Cherish walks alongside mothers in their prenatal, birthing, and postpartum process, investing in them spiritually and equipping them with training and resources to be the best moms that they can be. This truly, you guys, this is an amazing ministry doing effective, holistic work in Uganda. So you can join Cherish Uganda in their transformational work by following at Cherish Uganda on Instagram and X or Twitter. And I would highly encourage you, if you check out this ministry and God so leads you, please consider making a donation at cherishuganda.org to support their awesome work that they're doing. The financial piece is tricky. I think we've talked about this.
Sure.
Alicia talked about this, that like, if you're in the field running an orphanage, not too hard to raise money. Like that's it's familiar. It's what people want to give to.
Sure.
And the more the better. Hey, we doubled our orphans this year.
Right.
But we laugh. But
the problem's getting bigger. It's awesome.
but we like numbers. It's easier. Like we
Right.
got 100 next year. We're trying to get 200 and we need more money. Like it's that's a lot easier to get money, right? But to get money for what you're talking about, which we're going to get to in a second, is probably a lot harder, right? So could you get some people like, you know what, don't stop messing with the system. Like this is working for.
That's true. Well, I mean, there are financial incentives that are in play. So yeah, and that does kind of get after kind of some nonprofit questions. You know, you run a nonprofit, I work for a nonprofit, awesome nonprofit, CarePortal, and they, you know, you need money to run those, you know, organizations. So that's good, that's true. But if your impact model is actually creating harm, then you have to rethink it.
Yeah.
You know, and that's kind of the fundamental thing. So we definitely want people that are running children's homes in the global South to not feel shame, to not feel like, especially like, okay, if you were abusing children and you knew you were exploiting them, you should feel shame. Like, yeah, honestly, like shame on you. Like, shame on you. But most people are not like that. Most people go in with awesome intentions and they want to help kids, and it's just a learning journey. But again, once you learn better, you do something different. And then we need the donors to do the same. So a lot of the family-based care movement has been supported, yes, by micro donors for organizations that transition from orphanages to family-based care, and they retain their donor base, which is awesome. A lot of the kind of like burgeoning advocacy and so forth, and this is often the like social innovation. If you can know like the bell, like early adopters, you'll get some, you know, Christian foundations that will underwrite a lot of the kind of like advocacy and kind of network building within the family-based care. So that's kind of where we've been at, but we have not reached critical mass in terms of organizations that that you know that are just getting all this funding. Because again, our friends and colleagues at Faith to Action worked with Barna. I think we probably shared this when Alicia and I were on earlier, but they did a study a few years ago that said minimum $2.5 billion annually into orphanages from Western, you know, Christians.
2.5.
That's like 2.5 billion annually. So, and that's the conservative estimate. You know, that's like bottom line. That's basically World Vision USA plus Compassion International. You know, so it's just kind of like, okay, this is big time, and that's the kind of minimum. And most of them are like mom and pop nonprofits that you've never heard of, like the one I used to work for, you know, a long time ago. So there's a lot of money that's going into it, and we need people to kind of rethink, what do you want to give to? You should absolutely. I know you had Scott Harrison on, and he talked about how you know, only 4% of charitable donations are go overseas. You know, it was one thing that he mentioned was like, oh wow, that's incredible, and they have such a fantastic model at Charity Water. But you know, if it's only going to be 4%, we definitely need to do some reallocations when it comes to caring for orphans and vulnerable children. So we do need people to rethink, and we need donors to actually go to the orphanages that they support and say, and just ask questions. Just lead with questions. Hey, you know, what is being done to help kids get back with their families? Like, do you guys have any family-based services on top of your residential care? Like, where did the kids come from? Like questions like that just kind of seem like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a normal question, you know, like for them to kind of like actually ask those questions and start the conversation. Because if they come back and they say, oh yeah, all the kids have families, then the next question is, well, why aren't you helping them to grow up with their families? Or why aren't you promoting foster care and adoption, you know, alternative families? Why aren't you doing some of those things? So we do need donors to actually go to orphanages and just ask questions. No, don't go in and condemn or, you know, point your finger, but definitely go in and say, hey, I actually want to talk about the impact model, you know, and what are the results? What's happening with the kids? For sure, like the orphanage I used to work at, and I'm not going to, you know, you hear about the kids, you hear about the kids, you hear about the kids, and then they age out and they don't go well, and then you don't hear about the kids anymore. And that's kind of disingenuous.
Is there not a lot of follow-up with kids that
they might know what happened, but that story doesn't sell if you tell them, oh, and then the kid got addicted to such and such thing, and now they're kind of living on the streets. Like, you're not going to hear that story. You know what I mean? So like when the kids leave and then they aren't doing well, you just don't hear about it anymore because that's not going to sell. Like, hey, we failed this kid, like keep giving money, you know, but it's just like the reality is a lot of kids leave care and they just don't do well. And that's a bummer.
So let's go back to you know, sometime probably 2013, 14, 15 or something, like when you started to really rethink things and like, oh my gosh, I think I need to get involved in a better way to care for orphans and their families.
Right.
What did that transition look like for you?
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny. So we returned to Tanzania. So we were there did the short term stuff in 08, 09, then did the orphanage from 2010 to 2012. Then we took a year and a half off. I worked at a church in the interim, and then our daughter was born during that time. We were back in San Luis Obispo, and we returned to Tanzania in 2014, and we thought we were going to actually do we really wanted to do like discipleship with college students. Like we went back and thinking like we're gonna do this other thing, but understanding like orphan care was kind of the long-term thing. Well, we got back, and the organization that we were now working under had been doing attempting family care in kind of like a foster care format kind of thing, and we were offered essentially like, hey, this program's kind of been passed around between leaders. Like, you guys have a heart for orphan care. Would you take on this foster family? And we were going in and thinking like, oh, okay, we're going to replicate this. So 2014 was a year where we really kind of we renamed that program. We started working with that family. But what we thought was, we're just going to go to churches and we're going to recruit foster parents and we're going to basically set up foster care. Now, there's all sorts of different models and all sorts of different ways that you can do family-based care. This was just our model. So other models can be foster care focused, or supporting children with disability, or doing economic development for widows, like it can look like all sorts of different things. So this was just our model. There's a diverse range of models that are really helpful. But for us, we just started doing a lot of advocacy, especially being in Moshi, where there's a lot of tourism. We started doing, because tourism kind of brings short-termers, and short-termers end up, some of them being long-termers, and then they set up models of care that they were passed down, which is a lot of orphanages. So, just within Moshi, there's 17 orphanages just in the urban district.
Oh, wow.
But you can go to other areas of Tanzania and you won't find any because there's no tourism. So,
that's a whole discussion.
That's a whole discussion. Yeah. So that's the thing.
Orphanages typically are populated around areas that are high tourism.
For sure. Yeah, totally. So again, now if you go to that village where it's like, there's no orphanages, is that because there isn't poverty? Is that because there's no HIV/AIDS? Is that because there aren't people living with disability or something else? No, of course those people are there. That's just common in society there. The reality is, you get a bunch of people that go in and say, this is the service we're going to provide. And when there's not enough infrastructure to kind of, create meaningful social services, they'll just be like, well, what are people providing that are bringing in the money? And you just get person after person that say, oh, we'll start an orphanage. We'll start an orphanage. We'll start an orphanage. And you don't get enough people that go in and say, we want to do rehabilitation for kids that are living on the street, addicted to glue, and we're going to help them get off glue and get back into their families, or we just really feel like we're supposed to help kids with disability, with their education. And if you're not getting those types of services provided that actually strengthen families, and you just keep getting people to come in and say, well, we'll do an orphanage. That's going to be the service that's provided. Even though, even in a place like Tanzania, you go into the actual policy and it'll say orphanages and children's homes are to be a last resort. And yet in reality, when that's the only service that's provided, especially in a high tourism area, that is the service that will get used because it's the only one that's offered. So that's a whole other thing. Now I'm like,
so what happens to, but Moshi's not a huge town.
It's like top 10 in Tanzania.
100,000?
More.
Was it bigger than that?
Yeah, but probably less than 200,000. Yeah.
It's not as big as Arusha, right?
No, not as big as Arusha, but Arusha is also a lot of orphanages there too.
Okay. I guess my question is so you have one town with a lot of orphanages, high tourism area, another town, let's just say it's a similar size, no orphanage. There are orphans, or at least one parent, single orphans. What happens to the orphans in areas when an orphanage isn't an option? Yeah,
well, fundamentally, most orphans that are classified orphans are with their families anyways, because again, right. The kids that are going into orphanages are not even technically orphans anyways. So they've just gone through some other parent household. Yeah, they just or child-headed households. That's a whole other thing. You can have situations. I just had an organization on our show that was coming in and saying, yeah, we work with a lot of youth-led households, and
that's still better than being an orphanage.
Of course. Yes, totally.
So, some people that might be news. I mean,
that might be news to them, but
so
the reality is,
teenager raising their
elementary,
kids, that's better than all of them being
yes, with appropriate support from other community members or charitable organizations that are walking alongside. Yes, that is a better environment, and that is going to be more conducive to that kid growing up and being, a faithful citizen and a family person themselves.
Are there some? So I know some people are probably wondering, like, some of the home environments could be really bad. You got an alcoholic dad, abusive mother, or absentee.
Sure. Right.
She maybe is sleeping around. A dad died.
Right.
Kid has AIDS, not being taken care of. Like, are there some situations where the family environment is actually worse than an orphanage?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, surely there's got to be a few cases of that, or is that a prominent enough situation to where it should be considered? And if that is the case, what do you do in those situations where the family environment is actually really toxic for the kid?
Yeah, the reality is, when it comes to social services, things are never that dichotomous. Okay. So it's never like, well, it shouldn't be, at least. Like, you could either live detached from community and family in an orphanage, or live in an abusive home. Like, that's just, it's like it's a false dichotomy. Okay. Unfortunately, it happens, but it doesn't need to happen. Okay. So then you say, so maybe dad's a drunk and he's abusive, and the kid absolutely should not be in that home, and the kid needs to be removed. I've seen situations where, okay, that kid is then put in an orphanage, but then that orphanage says, we actually want to get these kids back to family. They can go and they can talk to that drunkard, father who abused them or whatever, and they're not going to place the kid there. They'll say, do you have other family? And he'll be like, oh yeah, I have a sister. She lives in the next town over and whatever. This is like the start of what we call family tracing, which is like a baseline assessment of like trying to figure out where's the best place for this kid. You go to that next place and you find, oh yeah, this aunt is great, but she's still in school. So she's like, oh yeah, no, I love my nephew. I wish that he could be here with me. I'm not able to take him right now, but you should go talk to my mom. Then you go to the next house, and now you're talking to grandmother. And grandmother's like, we didn't even know where he was. Like, yes, please bring him home. So this is like a process.
These are real scenarios. Are you thinking in your mind, these are actual things?
100%. And you can talk to people that have transitioned from orphanages to family care, and they'll be like, oh yeah, that sounds very commonplace to have that type of thing.
Almost every case, you family trace, and you can find
somebody
environment that's either a relative or a distant relative, or maybe even a friend of a relative,
right,
at the very least, that is healthy environment.
Right. Or you say, look, I've exhausted all of these, but there's a pastor or a teacher or somebody that has a connection to the kid that's willing to be their foster parent, and it's just like, okay, well, let's look there. So the idea that's like, well, either the kid's going to be abused in the family or detached and probably abused in the orphanage, and those are, it's pick your poison. Well, no, there are other options. We just have to actually do the hard work of saying, well, we're going to figure out what the best option is. There are times where residential care is an appropriate response, but it is a minority. The biggest,
meaning orphanages, or
residential, no, orphanages need to be done with.
Really?
But there are, I know.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, everything you're saying is like, either you're wrong and they need to be kept, or
right.
Done with.
So residential models can be necessary for sure, even in the United States. So we don't have orphanages really here anymore, but we do have different residential models. And sometimes those are very poorly run, and that can be an issue as well. But sometimes, say there's a kid and they, fell out of their home because, parents had addiction problems or something, and then they bounced around foster homes, and now they're, 16 years old and they have major behavioral issues, and they need, highly therapeutic, residential care in a small group type of setting. Like, that's a far cry from like, we need orphanages in Tanzania where we're institutionalizing, babies that are a couple days old. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like that whole thing needs to go away. But there are, within a continuum of care, a continuum of services, menu of services, there are very few cases that do actually need some sort of very therapeutic residential care. But again, that's such a minority, and we have such an over-reliance on residential models that are much more institutional, and for kids that really have no business there throughout the global South.
Okay. So once you just practically transitioning like that, like I can see the two models, and I can envision what an organization that's doing family-based care versus orphanage-based care. But to make that transition's got to be incredibly difficult, right? I mean, just again, even financially, and getting everybody on board and all the people, and what do you do with the kids that have been in the? So yeah, okay, let's go there. Let's say you're working. Let's just say you run an orphanage. You kind of wake up, realize this stuff. What do you start doing? Do you start doing family tracing with all the kids that are there? Is that basically the kind of heartbeat of?
Yeah, that can be a starting point for sure. So basically, you're going to go through two processes at once. One is you're going to do the social work, like reintegration of cases, type of cases, meaning like children, figuring out, getting into those cases and seeing, what's going to be the best path to permanency for this child that doesn't require them to spend the rest of their childhood in an orphanage. So that's kind of one level. And then the second level is you have an organizational transition, because your organization is now going to go through a change management process where hopefully at the end of it, you're not just closing your doors. Sometimes people do, and sometimes that's what's best. But hopefully you can transition to something, like what Brent is doing, or like other colleagues of mine that have done, where now they are, operating something that actually strengthens communities. So you're going to be doing those two processes, essentially concurrently. To one degree or another.
You've seen this happen. I mean,
this happens. This happens. But it hasn't. Again, we haven't reached critical mass. So that's why we need to reach more people and have them kind of think through.
So let's go to like the American church, where, again, most churches I talk to are supporting orphanages. Right, yeah. It's just so I've never even thought about it until probably 3 years ago, and now every time I hear it, it's just like I don't get feisty. It's just like, oh.
You don't get feisty, Preston?
I don't know, because it's
I get feisty.
I bet you have more of a right to. For me, it's like it's. Again, I put myself 4 years ago, and I wouldn't even thought about it. Like,
right.
What do you mean? It's wrong? But it would have taken for me at least, it probably would have taken an hour-long conversation where I would have said, "Oh gosh, like I didn't even know these questions. I didn't know these categories existed." How? I mean, I'm sure you've encountered this probably quite often with American churches. And you start trying to help them see maybe a bigger picture. Let's call it that.
Right.
How is it received? Do you get pushback? Do you get people who say, "Oh yeah," and then they just?
It's a mix. Each person responds differently. I think as a care reform movement, we're still trying to crack that egg.
Is that tough egg to crack?
It is tough.
Because I can imagine there's probably somebody who's been at church for 48 years. They started this orphanage ministry 47 years ago. Maybe they've got a lot of money. They have some influence, maybe power at the church, or gosh, that person has a strong personality. Or that I don't want to break their heart. They've invested everything into this orphanage ministry at the church. And do you get a lot of that? Like just a little deep relational, maybe even financial
and emotional.
I
think that's a big
power connections. People aren't really pre-programmed to rethink foundational questions.
I don't want to be overly cynical, but you've maybe heard this term, American exceptionalism. That definitely plays here, where it's like,
keep going. How does that intersect with this?
Well, I mean, because there's a notion of like, oh yeah, we agree, kids are best in family. Yes, that's true. But our kids are different, and the way we care for them is different. And these are really our kids anyways. These are like our sons and daughters. These aren't, and then they just kind of make themselves, again, the exception, rather than kind of embracing the reality that these kids are going to grow up, and you live in another country, and you've been donating and supporting and running this thing. But the reality is these kids came from somewhere else. They'll return to somewhere else. And, you're not an exception.
I mean, could there be a bit of ethnocentrism? I hesitate saying racism, because I think that term can be thrown around, but
it's not racism. It is ethnocentric though. Yes.
But it's like, well, those kids they're over there.
So, yeah.
I don't know. It's they're over there. And
I guess if you could pin it in a way that you could kind of say racist, but it's almost kind of like they're the deserving poor. It's kind of more like that sociological like thing of like, well, this is our charitable, thing for these kids that we really love and want to care for. And yet at the same time, you are settling for something subpar. So like
It's
if
something
you would not want
tolerate
for your own kids.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
You would not want this for your own kids. So there is kind of that like, but then there's, I mean, honestly, one of the things that happens in a lot of these American run children's homes, unfortunately, and I don't want to say anything that was like I'm disparaging. Like it's not about that. But there is nonetheless often this, dynamic where um they look at what's going on in the broader community and they see poverty and they see this and they say, "Oh no, it'll be better for
Mm.
for the kids to be in this kind of rich Western run orphanage than to be out there in the community." And yeah, we know they have family, and yeah, the family comes and visits once a month and
But they
shares
live in a
candy with
house
them.
with a dirt floor.
But they live, yeah, and it's
yeah.
just kind of like, and
Huh.
the thing is, kids do better in a poor family than they do in a rich orphanage. That's just
That's a fundamental.
that's just fundamental,
Right?
and they want that.
People get that,
And they want that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, sometimes people that are running these systems are not really taking into account that actually the kid would be better, even if they were poor. It would be better for them to be poor and in a family than in a rich orphanage where, to be honest, they'll likely be poor when they grow up anyways, because they're not going to have the social skills or the social capital, especially in the global South, where you really actually need a community to not only for your mental and social well-being, but also for your economic well-being. Like you actually need that community, when you grow up. So.
And do they have a stigma of being raised in an orphanage in a lot of cultures?
There can be, yeah. You can
versus being in a poor home in a let's say a wealthier orphanage. You're still the stigma.
Right, yeah. Because poverty, again, it's not like nobody wants to be poor, and we can talk through poverty and what that feels like, but it's a lot more common, versus the kids that are in orphanages.
Mm-hmm.
We would work with an organization that's doing alternative family care in Ethiopia and Salamta Family Project. And, we've heard this where these kids unfortunately had already gone into an orphanage. They tried to see if they could reunify. They tried to see if they were candidates for adoption. And when those things have been exhausted, they put them into an alternative family. So meaning like a mom with a small group of children in the community. And those kids are treated a lot more like just any other kid, as opposed to being the orphanage kid. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I just distinctly remember like one of the kids that grew up in one of these alternative family households, hearing him say with his own mouth, like, I saw how kids in the orphanages were treated, and we were just treated like we were just from the community, because they are,
Wow.
So yeah, there can be a stigma as well. It's not all the time, but it can happen for sure.
Do you have some positive cases of churches kind of talking to them, and then they see the issues and everything, and then they make a concerted effort to
transform?
Yeah.
Totally. Yep. Those churches are out there as well.
And what does that look like? Are there what are other organizations that can help churches do that?
I would definitely encourage people. So again, I don't work for Faith to Action, but I'm on their advisory network, and they're great. Faith to Action Initiative. I would reach out to our friends there. They're doing a lot of work within that space. I've done a lot of work in that space. People can reach out to me as well. But
what's your organization?
So, well, my main job, I have to give a shout out, is CarePortal, which that's my 9 to 5. I did set up a coaching collaborative as well called Canopy International. So yeah. So people can find us there, but I mean, but you'll just be getting connected with people that are even better at this than I am, because we've had people that have come through and just said, yeah, we were doing the orphanage thing, but we also saw the light.
Most people listening are not pastors or leaders of churches, and maybe some of them are like, gosh, my church supports an orphanage. I would love to maybe have a conversation with some of the leaders
right, yeah.
about this, to maybe at least raise the question,
right.
Are there better ways? I heard this podcast. Like, what have you seen to be most effective for people that maybe that aren't on leadership at a church, to go to their leaders and at least have this conversation?
Well, I think you can get equipped. So there are resources. So starting with some of those people that I just mentioned and some of those groups, you can get coached up and support to have those conversations, because, there are professionals that work in this space, that work in care reform, that are willing to have that conversation to support you, so that you know how to have that, conversation, because it does take a mindset shift, and we do need change agents. And sometimes that change agent is not a primary decision maker, but they can nonetheless influence that decision maker, So I think that is, so yeah, first get support and then just have the conversation. And if you're a donor, you do have some power, and unfortunately what we'll sometimes see is people will say like, well, don't pull your funds. Yeah, don't initially pull your funds until you've had the conversation. But if you've had that conversation and they just say, no, we're really committed to having kids in the orphanage, then you can give them notice. And they're just like, okay, I respect that. It's not my decision to make, but I want to reinvest my money that is going to actually support. And sometimes people are hesitant to say that, but the reality is, because it'd be like, well, aren't you putting the kids more at risk if you pull your funds? And the reality is, if those people are not willing to actually think through what it looks like to better protect and help kids get into family, then they may not have their best interests if you've had a good faith conversation with them about considering transition. And look, donors fall off at times. Like I haven't donated to the same organization for the last 15 years. That's not how I do my charitable giving. People will do it different ways. So it's also okay for you to reprioritize yourself as a donor and say, I had the conversation because I value these people and I value this organization and I want the best for those kids. But I'm also going to kind of rethink how I want to express my faith through my charitable giving. And I want to do something that's going to strengthen kids to live in families.
Yeah. What would be the, have you had like you say you have all these stats and facts, you've had the experience, you bring it all. What's the best pushback you've got? Or like what's the
right
thanks but no thanks? Is it just an emotional wall that's like,
financial, because there is a lot of money that's wrapped up in it, and sometimes it's their livelihood, whether that's somebody that is living in the country,
so they
like a national,
like, well,
they can,
I'm wrapped up in this financially.
I mean, they may not say it, but that's a real thing. It's like I have kids to feed. It's just like, if I were to lose my job, that would be really hard. And if they were thinking along those lines, now the reality is we don't want anybody to lose their job. We would just want to repurpose that workforce, really. But if they kind of feel like I have a financial stake in this, that could be another barrier, to overcome. Sometimes it can be just like, yeah, we just have a different philosophy and we really think that this orphanage is the right thing.
Is there any counter argument, or just agree to disagree? Sorry, without like
saying
your stats are wrong, your experience is off. I know a bunch of amazing orphanages.
I've spoken with people and I've spoken with people. I have one family in particular, in my head, that they were in another area of Tanzania and they were coming into Moshi, and they had tried to run an orphanage in this other area with a different local pastor, and they were trying to do that. And they said, yeah, it really kind of fell apart. We found out he was stealing money. And I said, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Like, what happened to the kids? And they're like, we don't know what happened to the kids. I was like, wow, this, like everything you're saying like sounds really terrible. And yet now they're saying, but we're going to do it now and we're going to do it different. And it's just like, you literally had the whole thing fall apart. You don't even know where the kids are. And now you're going to work with, and the crazy thing is, like, they started to work with a pastor that I had done work with and I had been at his church running a conference. And he was like, yes, we need kids and families. Yes, the spirit of adoption, Romans 8, yes, widows and orphans, Isaiah 68 or Psalm 68, Isaiah 1, like, yes, like this is what we need. And then these other Americans come in with money and they say, well, we're going to give you a job. We're going to do it. And he just turns on a dime, kind of thing. And it's just, which is a bummer because he's actually a friend, and a pastor that we had worked with. So sometimes you'll get people like that where they're just like, we actually did this and it totally fell apart and it wasn't good. And we're telling you it wasn't good, but now we're going to try again.
I could see that. I could see someone saying it wasn't the intrinsic nature of the orphanage. It was this specific situation that.
But then this is a little scapegoating. If you just say, well, it was a bad dude that we were working with. Well, it's just like, well, how do you know that it's going to work now? Like, you don't. Yeah. But you would probably say, yeah, it's best for kids to grow up in families. But then you're going to say, but we're going to do this different thing anyways. It's just, so it does. So you'll get people that, of course, obviously, the majority of the orphan care, global orphan care space is invested into orphanages. Mm-hmm. So, of course, you have a lot of people that have their rationale for why they do that. And it could be emotional or financial, or it could be that's just all that they know. Yeah. Maybe they haven't learned. Maybe they're going to listen to Theology in the Raw and be like, oh, maybe I could try something. And hopefully that's the case. But at the same time, maybe they just are really committed to that practice. Yeah. So, but again, the proof is in the pudding. Yeah. If the kids aren't turning out well, then it's a problem.
Brandon, thanks so much for being on Theology Raw again, live in my basement. So you mentioned, Faith to Action, CarePortal, Canopy International. Any other places you can point people to, resources, books? Is there a book
Sure.
do you have a go-to book that somebody's like, all right, I want to really roll my sleeves?
So orphan care books, unfortunately, have not sold very well. So the best one was like 10 years ago. I think I mentioned it previously. That's Orphan Justice, but it's a little outdated. Honestly, if I so I do just kind of want to say with CarePortal is a domestic program, and it is awesome. It's amazing. We're working in over 30 different states within the nation, connecting churches with kids that are in crisis and families in crisis. So that's like one of the things, like even when we talk about like, what should we be doing globally? Well, what are you doing domestically? And CarePortal is like one of those things where it's like, you could actually impact kids directly, and you don't have to be a foster or adoptive parent to be a part. So yeah. It's not about like, I did that thing. Like when I came back from Tanzania, I was working like for a local foster family agency, like recruiting foster and adoptive parents. And that's a whole other conversation. But the reality is most people are not called to be foster and adoptive parents. I'm an adoptive dad. And it's like, and my son would say the same thing. It's one of the hardest things. It's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's a gospel thing, but it's also really hard. But we get a lot of people that say, I don't know how to, support and care, for vulnerable kids in my own neighborhood. And that's, I mean, even getting to the global thing. Sometimes we're sending people out to go do orphan care overseas, and it's just like, you don't even have any fruit on the tree in your own backyard. Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's like CarePortal is one of those things where it's like anybody can contribute, anybody can support vulnerable children. It's a really cool care sharing technology that really kind of drives impact. So I would just kind of say, actually, before you even go overseas, find out a way to actually help foster kids. We got over 400,000 kids in the foster care system here. And it's like, man, so what I'm doing right now, most of my time, my full-time job, and the Canopy International and Think Global, Do Justice, the podcast that I do, all of that's just like a passion project, basically. But CarePortal is what I'm driving in Seattle. So I do encourage people, because we are in like over 30 states, to check out CarePortal. But if you are running an orphanage, what we've been talking about, for the course of this conversation, reach out to my friends at Faith to Action. You can reach out to the coaching co-op that I set up at Canopy International. There are resources out there. You don't have to do it alone. And these kids deserve better. And it's a more biblical model. I mean, widows and orphans together, the spirit of adoption. You would not read
noticed that. I mean, it's one of the most famous verses ever, to care for orphans and widows in their distress.
Yeah. And we just focus on the orphans.
Apart from the
we just take them out of the equation, when the reality is they lost the same person. They lost the patriarch of the family, the provider, the protector. They lost that. That made them widow and fatherless,
Not parentless.
Not parentless. Yeah. Yeah. That's one group. That's why they're always listed together. So it really is, how can we care for vulnerable families? So even, again, locally, single mom, maybe she's getting her kids back. We talk about reunification. That's a huge thing. We should be promoting reunification. Most kids in foster care in the United States are going to get reunified. That's their most likely spot that they're going to go if they're going to reach permanency, is to actually get reunified. So that means that mom, or maybe even that dad, has overcome a lot of stuff, but they may need support. And that's why, CarePortal and a lot of other organizations, highly collaborative, are actually bringing connections so that those families can also get strengthened. We need to see families strengthened. We need to see families intact. But it requires, a community. You can have, me and you are both employed. We have our kids, and, we're doing what we can, but even us, we rely on other people. That's just kind of the intrinsic nature of being a family within a broader community. So whether that's domestically or overseas, that's what we need. So, but yeah, if you are running an orphanage, reach out. There are resources out there for you.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Well, thanks for being on Theology again, man. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.